The air at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual Oracles Gala shimmered with the weight of old money and new tech billions. It was a universe unto itself where names like Rockefeller and Gates echoed in whispered conversations. Into this world walked Coraline Reyes, a woman with a $5,000 dress that felt like a cheap costume and a secret she didn't even know she carried. That night, a self-important millionaire dripping in arrogance and disdain would look her in the eye and tell her, "You don't belong here." He was right. She didn't belong there as a guest. She belonged there as the owner. The Charles Engelhard Court at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was not designed for mortals. On this crisp October evening, it had been transformed into a pantheon for the gods of capital and commerce. The annual Oracles Gala, hosted by the enigmatic founder of Aethelred Holdings, Gideon Pierce, was the undisputed apex of New York's social and financial calendar. To be invited was to be anointed. To be seen was to be relevant. Towering floral arrangements composed of white orchids and delphiniums reached towards the glass ceiling, their scent mingling with the expensive perfumes of the guests and the faint, clean smell of money. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved like ghosts, their silver trays laden with flutes of Dom Perignon and canapes topped with Caspian caviar. The gentle murmur of conversation was a symphony of power deals being born and rivals being buried between polite sips of champagne. Coraline Reyes felt less like a guest and more like an imposter who had successfully breached the castle walls. She clutched the stem of her champagne flute so tightly she was afraid it might shatter. Her dress, a deep emerald silk gown by a designer she could barely afford, felt inadequate next to the bespoke Dior and Valentino creations that floated past her. She had spent 2 months' salary on it, a desperate attempt to build a fragile armor for this single night. She was here on the personal invitation of Gideon Pierce himself, a fact that was both her shield and her mystery. Gideon had been a close friend and early business partner of her late father, David Reyes. After her father's sudden death 5 years ago, Gideon had become a distant, benevolent guardian, checking in with a phone call twice a year and ensuring her tuition at Columbia Business School was always paid from a trust she didn't fully understand. His invitation had come with a simple, handwritten note. "It's time, Cora. Your father would have wanted you here." She didn't feel like she belonged. Her world was one of late-night study sessions, SWOT analysis presentations, and the modest 2-bedroom apartment she shared with a roommate in the West Village. This world of inherited fortunes and casual extravagance was alien territory. She recognized faces from the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. Tech titans from Silicon Valley clinked glasses with Wall Street hedge fund managers and real estate moguls. She was trying to make herself small near a marble statue of Perseus, when a voice, slick with condescension, cut through the ambient noise. "Well, well, look what we have here. I didn't realize the Oracles Gala was running a charity drive this year." Cora turned. Standing before her was Brendan Holloway, the heir to Holloway Capital, a notoriously aggressive private equity firm that had made its fortune through hostile takeovers and ruthless asset stripping. He was handsome in a cruel, predictable way, chiseled jaw, perfect teeth, and eyes that held the flat, predatory gleam of a shark. He was flanked by 2 other men who mirrored his smug expression. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized him from a business ethics class where he was used as a case study for all the wrong reasons. His father, Cormac Holloway, had been trying for years to orchestrate a takeover of Aethelred Holdings, a move Gideon Pierce had consistently and gracefully thwarted. "Mr. Holloway," Cora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm surprised to see you here. I thought Gideon Pierce preferred his guests to have integrity." Brendan's smile tightened. "Cute. A little bird told me you were David Reyes' girl. The brilliant strategist who couldn't even manage his own portfolio long enough to leave his daughter a pot to piss in. Let me guess, Pierce feels sorry for you." Is this your big night out before you go back to serving coffee or whatever it is you do? His friends snickered. The sound was ugly amplified in the grand space. People nearby began to notice the confrontation, their polite conversations faltering as they turned to watch the drama unfold. This was better than the caviar. My father was a better man than you'll ever be, Cora said, her knuckles white on her glass. He built things. You just break them for parts. Brendan took a step closer, invading her personal space. His cologne was overpowering, a scent of entitlement and expensive leather. He leaned in his voice, a low, venomous whisper, meant for her, but loud enough for the growing audience to hear. Let me give you a piece of advice. People like you're a novelty, a little charity case for the billionaires to feel good about. You get one night to see how the real world works, to taste the champagne you'll never be able to afford again. But don't get comfortable. He gestured widely with his hand, encompassing the entire, breathtaking scene. Because you don't belong here. His words struck her like a physical blow. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once doubted their place in the world. He was articulating her deepest, most paralyzing fear. The feeling of being an outsider, an imposter, a fraud. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and shameful. She saw the pity and morbid curiosity in the eyes of the onlookers. They were the jury, and Brendan Holloway was the prosecutor, and she had already been found guilty of the crime of not being one of them. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of her own life. But then she saw him. Across the court, standing near the grand staircase, was Gideon Pierce. He was an imposing man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't looking at Brendan. He was looking directly at her, and on his face was not pity, but a look of profound disappointment and a flicker of something else. Something that looked like cold, calculated anger. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a gesture that said, "Not yet." Brendan, basking in his perceived victory, straightened up and turned to his friends. "Come on, let's get a real drink. The air over here has become rather common." As he walked away, the laughter of his cronies trailing behind him, Cora stood frozen. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. The glittering hall felt like a cage, and all the gilded people were its She had never felt more alone in her life. The host's words echoed in her head. "It's time, Cora. Time for what? Time to be publicly shredded by the very kind of man her father had spent his life outsmarting." She didn't understand. All she knew was the bitter sting of Brendan's words. "You don't belong here." The rest of the hour passed in a blur of managed dignity. Cora found a secluded balcony overlooking the darkened expanse of Central Park, the city lights a distant, indifferent glitter. She forced herself to breathe, to push back the burning shame. Brendan Holloway's words circled in her mind like vultures. He hadn't just insulted her, he had insulted her father's memory, reducing a brilliant man's life to a footnote of failure. A waiter appeared silently at her elbow. "Mr. Pierce asked me to find you Ms. Reyes. He requests your presence in the Dendur Temple wing." The Temple of Dendur, housed in its own cavernous glass-walled gallery, was Gideon's favorite part of the museum. He often held his most private conversations there, beside the ancient sandstone structure, a monument that had witnessed millennia. Following the waiter, Cora felt a fresh wave of anxiety. Was Gideon going to politely ask her to leave? Had her confrontation with Brendan caused a scene that embarrassed her host? She entered the magnificent hall. The temple, illuminated by dramatic uplighting, stood proudly before a vast window looking out onto the park. At its base, beside the reflecting pool, meant to simulate the Nile, stood Gideon Pierce. He dismissed the waiter with a nod and turned to Cora. His expression was no longer angry, but somber and intensely focused. "Coraline," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the silence of the room. I saw what happened. Gideon. I am so sorry, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. He said things about my father. You have nothing to apologize for. Gideon interrupted, his gaze sharp. Brendan Holloway behaved exactly as I expected he would. Arrogant, cruel, and foolishly transparent. I am the one who should apologize. I put you in that position without properly arming you first. Cora frowned, confused. Arming me? I don't understand. Gideon gestured for her to walk with him along the edge of the reflecting pool. Your father, David, was more than just my friend Cora. He was the architect of Aethelred Holdings. I may have been the face and the initial capital, but he was the ghost in the machine. He designed the algorithms we use for market prediction. He structured the diversification strategy that saved us during the 2008 crash. He was a genius, and the corporate world, in its infinite short-sightedness, never gave him his due. Cora listened, her heart aching. She knew her father had been brilliant, but he rarely spoke of his work in detail, always dismissing it with a wave of his hand as playing with numbers. When your father and I founded this company, Gideon continued, his voice resonating with history, we made a pact. We structured our partnership in a very specific way. My shares were Class A voting stock. His were a unique class of founders' shares, Class B. They carried immense weight, but were held in a trust designed to lie dormant. He was a patient man. He knew that vultures like Cormac Holloway would circle eventually, and he wanted a defense mechanism, a hidden power that no one could see coming. Gideon stopped walking and turned to face her directly. The light from the temple cast long shadows across his face. Your father was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 3 months before he died. He told no one, not even me, until the final weeks. He didn't want pity. He wanted to work. Tears welled in Cora's eyes as a painful memory surfaced. Her father, looking tired and thin, hunched over his computer late at night. She had thought it was just work stress. The guilt was a fresh, sharp pain. In those last months, Gideon said softly, he wasn't just working, he was preparing. He used his personal funds, every last cent he had, and leveraged his position to quietly, almost invisibly, acquire fractional shares from retiring employees and through third-party brokers. He consolidated them into the trust. He called it his legacy insurance. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cora, the trust your father left you was not for your tuition. That was a separate fund I established. The real trust, the one holding his entire life's work, was set to vest and become active under one of 2 conditions, either on your 30th birthday or on the day I, as the executor, deemed you ready to understand its power. After watching you graduate top of your class from Columbia, and after seeing the fire in your eyes tonight when you stood up to that Holloway degenerate, I've made my decision. You're ready. Cora felt dizzy, the world tilting on its axis. Ready for what? What's in the trust? Gideon Pierce allowed a small grim smile to touch his lips. Brendan Holloway is a millionaire who inherited his father's company. His father, Cormac, is a billionaire trying to execute a hostile takeover of Aethelred. For the last 6 months, Holloway Capital has been buying up stock, trying to secure enough to force a vote and oust the board. They believe they are close. They believe they control around 42% of the available shares. He let the suspense hang in the ancient air. What Cormac Holloway doesn't know, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is that the game was over before he even began to play. Your father's trust, the one that now belongs entirely to you, doesn't just contain a small block of shares, Cora. David was meticulous. He was a visionary. The trust holds his original founder's stock plus everything he acquired in those final months. As of this morning, when I signed the final transfer papers with your attorneys, that trust holds exactly 51% of Aethelred Holdings. Cora's breath caught in her throat. The sound of her own blood roaring in her ears was louder than the city outside. 51%. It wasn't just a number. It was a crown. It was a weapon. It was control. I, I'm the majority shareholder. She whispered the words, feeling foreign and impossible on her tongue. You are. Gideon confirmed, his eyes gleaming with a fierce protective pride. You are not a guest at this gala, Coraline. You are the queen who has just walked unnoticed into her own throne room. Brendan Holloway didn't tell you that you don't belong here. He and his father are the ones who are about to find out that they no longer do. He then handed her a sleek black tablet. On the screen was a detailed breakdown of the company's holdings board member profiles and a single highlighted file named the Nightingale Protocol. Your father created this, Gideon explained. It's his complete vision for the future of Aethelred. A plan for sustainable growth, ethical investments, and employee profit sharing. It's everything the Holloways despise. He left it for you. Study it. The main announcements are in 90 minutes. That should be enough time for you to prepare for your new role. Cora stared at the tablet, then back at Gideon, then at the ancient temple before her. The humiliation she had felt earlier was evaporating, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. Her father hadn't failed. He had been playing a long game, a game that extended beyond his own life. And he had just passed the final winning move to her. The 90 minutes Gideon had allotted her felt like both a lifetime and a fleeting second. He led her away from the Temple of Dendur to a private suite on the museum's upper floor, an office reserved for the Met's chairman, which Gideon had borrowed for the evening. It was panelled in dark wood, smelled of old books and lemon oil, and offered a god's eye view of the glittering gala below. This is Franklin Shaw, Gideon said, introducing a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a pin-sharp suit who had been waiting for them. He was your father's personal attorney and is the co-trustee. He'll walk you through the immediate legal realities. For the next hour, Cora underwent the most intense crash course of her life. Franklin Shaw, with the calm precision of a seasoned expert, laid out the architecture of her new power. He explained the rights of a majority shareholder, the power to appoint board members, to approve or veto major corporate actions, to, in essence, set the entire direction of a multi-billion-dollar global corporation. The Holloway threat is real, Shaw explained, pointing to a chart on his tablet. They've been leveraging their assets to acquire shares on the open market. They also seem to have an ally on the inside. We've noticed some unusual trading patterns originating from a fund linked to Lorraine Adler. Cora's mind flashed to a woman she'd seen earlier, standing near Brendan Holloway. Lorraine Adler was a long-serving board member at Aethelred, known for her sharp intellect and seemingly unshakable loyalty to Gideon. She was often called the Iron Lady of the board. The thought of her betrayal sent a chill down Cora's spine. Lorraine, Gideon murmured, his expression darkening. I'm not surprised. Disappointed, but not surprised. Cormac Holloway has always been good at finding the cracks in people's loyalty. As Shaw detailed the legalities, Cora delved into her father's file, the Nightingale Protocol. It wasn't just a business plan, it was a manifesto. David Reyes had laid out a decade-long strategy to pivot Aethelred away from speculative, high-risk ventures and into long-term, sustainable technologies, green energy, biotech research, and ethical AI development. He'd identified acquisition targets, projected revenue streams, and even drafted a new corporate charter centered on what he called the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. Reading her father's words, Cora felt an intimate connection to the man she had lost. She saw his brilliance, his foresight, and his deep-seated belief that capitalism could be a force for good, not just for greed. He wrote of building a legacy, not just an empire. The protocol was his last will and testament, not of money, but of purpose. And he had entrusted it to her. A new strength began to solidify within her. This wasn't about revenge on Brendan Holloway. His petty cruelty was a symptom of the disease her father had wanted to cure. This was about legacy. It was about proving that David Reyes' vision was not the naive dream of a failed idealist, but a viable, powerful future. What's the first step? Cora asked, looking up from the tablet, her eyes clear and focused. Shaw and Gideon exchanged a look of approval. The first step is the announcement, Gideon said. Power that remains hidden is useless. Tonight, we don't just reveal your position. We cauterize the Holloway threat in the most public way imaginable. They will challenge it, Shaw warned. Cormac will launch a proxy fight. He'll call you, inexperienced, a puppet. He'll try to paint this as a desperate last-ditch trick by Gideon. Let him. Cora said, a cold fire in her voice. He'll be arguing with a ghost. I'm not going to fight him on his terms. I'm going to implement my father's protocol. While he's screaming in the press, we'll be building the future. A knock came at the door. It was Gideon's personal assistant, a young woman with a headset and an air of supreme competence. Mr. Pierce, it's 10 minutes to the address. The major news outlets are all patched in. Bloomberg, CNBC, Reuters. They're all live. Gideon stood. It's time. He looked at Cora, his gaze searching. Her $5,000 dress no longer seemed like a costume. Her posture had changed. The nervous, overwhelmed girl who had arrived hours earlier was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just inherited a kingdom and, more importantly, a purpose. Are you ready, Coraline? He asked. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with something more potent than oxygen. It felt like resolve. My father was, she said simply. So I will be. As they prepared to descend back into the lion's den, Gideon paused and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. One more thing your father left for you. He handed her a small velvet-covered box. Cora opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a simple, elegant lapel pin shaped like a nightingale in mid-flight, crafted from platinum. He had it made the week he passed. Gideon said quietly, he said that when the time came you should wear it so that everyone would know who you were speaking for. Cora carefully fastened the pin to the shoulder of her emerald dress. It was a small piece of metal, but it felt heavier than a suit of armor. It was her father's sigil, and tonight she would carry it into battle. They walked out of the office and towards the grand staircase, the low hum of the unknowing crowd rising up to meet them. Down below, Brendan Holloway was holding court, laughing with his friends, utterly oblivious to the reckoning that was about to befall him. Descending the grand staircase with Gideon Pierce was like parting the Red Sea. The ambient chatter of the gala hushed as heads turned, tracking their progress. The collective gaze of New York's elite felt different now. Cora was no longer an anonymous face in the crowd, but the subject of intense speculation. Why was she the girl who had been so publicly humiliated just an hour ago now at the side of the night's host, descending towards the main stage? She could feel Brendan Holloway's eyes on her from across the room. She didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely forward. She kept her chin high, her hand resting lightly on Gideon's arm, the cool metal of the nightingale pin, a reassuring presence on her shoulder. They reached the stage that had been set up in front of the museum's main entrance. A podium bearing the Aethelred Holdings logo stood waiting. Behind it, a massive screen glowed with the same emblem. Banks of cameras from major financial news networks were positioned discreetly, their red recording lights blinking like predatory eyes. Gideon stepped up to the podium. A respectful silence fell over the Engelhard court. Even the waiters stood still. Good evening, everyone. Gideon began, his voice calm and commanding, amplified throughout the hall. Thank you for joining us tonight at this year's Oracle's Gala. For 20 years, we have gathered here to celebrate innovation leadership and the spirit of forward thinking that drives our global economy. Tonight, however, is different. Tonight is not just about celebrating the future. It's about announcing it. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Cora stood slightly behind him, and to his right, in the full view of the audience and the cameras. She could see Brendan Holloway standing with his father Cormac, who had just arrived. Cormac Holloway was a bull of a man, with a florid face and an air of brutish impatience. He whispered something to his son, and they both shared a smug, dismissive smirk. They clearly thought this was just another of Gideon's pompous speeches. Lorraine Adler stood nearby, her face a mask of polite neutrality, but Cora could see the tension in her hands as she clutched her evening bag. Aethelred Holdings is at a pivotal moment, Gideon continued. As many of you are aware from the financial press, there has been significant interest in the direction of our company. There are forces that wish to see us change our course to abandon long-term vision for short-term profit. They see Aethelred as a prize to be captured, an asset to be stripped, a legacy to be dismantled. He let his gaze drift for a moment, sweeping over the Holloways without overtly singling them out. Cormac's smirk faltered slightly. What these individuals failed to understand, Gideon said, his voice hardening, is that the foundation of this company is stronger than they could ever imagine. It was built not just by me, but by my late partner, a man of singular genius and foresight, Mr. David Reyes. At the mention of her father's name, a murmur went through the crowd. Cora felt a surge of pride that pushed aside the last of her nerves. David was not just a strategist, he was a guardian, Gideon declared. He foresaw a time when the soul of this company might be threatened, and he put in place a contingency, a final masterstroke to protect his life's work. A legacy he entrusted not to the whims of the market, but to the hands of the one person he knew would understand its true purpose. The tension in the room was now thick enough to taste. Cormac Holloway was no longer smirking. He was staring intently at Gideon, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Brendan looked confused, glancing from Gideon to Cora and back again, a dawning horror beginning to etch itself onto his handsome face. Gideon turned slightly and gestured towards Cora. That person is with us tonight. She has listened to the whispers she has endured, the arrogance of those who believe wealth is a birthright, and she has carried her father's legacy with a quiet dignity they could never comprehend. He looked directly at Cora, a clear signal. This was her moment. She took a half step forward into the full glare of the lights. The nightingale pin on her shoulder caught the light, flashing like a star. It is my profound honor, Gideon announced, his voice booming with triumph, to announce a fundamental change in the ownership structure of Aethelred Holdings. The controlling interest, the ultimate authority over the future of this corporation, has now been fully vested. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new majority shareholder of Aethelred Holdings, Ms. Coraline Reyes. Gideon Pierce's voice, imbued with the weight of history and the thrill of revelation, echoed through the grand hall. Please welcome the new majority shareholder of Aethelred Holdings, Ms. Coraline Reyes. The name fell into the room, not like a sound, but like a physical object, sucking all the air and noise into a sudden, crushing vacuum. For a moment, that stretched into an eternity, the world stood still. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of multi-million-dollar deals, the subtle strains of the string quartet, it all ceased. In that profound silence, the only thing Cora could hear was the powerful rhythmic drumbeat of her own heart against her ribs. The brilliant lights of the gala seemed to intensify, sharpening the edges of every face, turning the scene into a frozen, hyper-realistic tableau. Her eyes were locked across the room. She saw it all. She saw the precise moment the name Coraline Reyes registered on Cormac Holloway's face. The older man's brutish confidence, a feature as permanent as his scowl, simply evaporated. His florid complexion turned the color of old parchment, and the thick, unlit cigar he'd been holding slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, rolling silently across the polished marble floor. His mind, a ruthless calculator of leverage and power, was frantically running the numbers, slamming again and again into an impossible, ruinous conclusion. But it was Brendan's reaction that was a masterpiece of collapse. His initial expression was one of smug confusion, as if Gideon had misspoken a senior moment in front of his most important guests. He glanced at his father for confirmation of the joke, but saw only a mask of horror. The confusion on Brendan's face then curdled, shifting rapidly through the stages of disbelief, a slight shake of the head, a narrowing of the eyes, the faint, desperate curl of his lip as he tried to form a scoff that wouldn't come. He looked at Cora, this ghost from a lower world, and his entire life's certainty, the bedrock of privilege upon which he was built, cracked beneath him. The silence shattered. It wasn't a gradual return to noise, but an explosion. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 guests, a single unified sound of shock. It was immediately followed by a cacophony of frantic, urgent whispers. Phones materialized in every hand, thumbs flying across screens as the news was blasted to brokers in New York, Tokyo, and London. A champagne flute, forgotten in a nerveless hand, fell to the floor and shattered the sound sharp and violent. The press pool, cordoned off near the side, broke ranks. Their professional decorum vanished, replaced by the raw, predatory instinct of journalists who have just witnessed the story of the year detonate before their eyes. Reyes. Is that Reyes? One reporter shouted. What percentage? We need the exact percentage of the holding, barked another. Through it all, Brendan Holloway finally found his voice. It was not the smooth, condescending baritone he had used on her earlier. It was a raw, strangled cry of pure panic. No, he mouthed the word, a silent prayer against reality. He grabbed his father's arm. Dad, no, that's not possible. Cormac, lost in his own nightmare, didn't respond. Brendan's voice grew louder, cracking with desperation, a sound that sliced through the general din. She's a nobody. A charity case. This is a lie. His outburst, intended to expose a fraud, only served to expose his own abject panic. A few nearby guests shushed him, their expressions a mix of pity and contempt. He had just confirmed his own ruin. On the stage, Gideon Pierce held up a hand, and the sheer force of his presence commanded a sliver of quiet. Ms. Reyes will not be taking questions tonight, he stated, his voice a firm rebuke to the chaos. However, she has asked me to read a brief statement on her behalf. He held up a card, though his eyes were fixed on the Holloways, a general delivering the terms of surrender. Each word he spoke was a precision strike, a torpedo, launched at the foundations of Holloway Capital. Effective tomorrow morning, Aethelred Holdings will begin the immediate implementation of the Nightingale Protocol. A new wave of murmurs swept the financial experts in the crowd. A protocol pre-planned. This wasn't an improvisation, it was an execution. This new directive, authored by the late David Reyes, will pivot our corporate strategy towards sustainable long-term growth in the green energy and ethical technology sectors. Cormac Holloway visibly flinched. Gideon was not just announcing a new direction. He was declaring war on the Holloways' entire business model of asset stripping and fossil fuel exploitation. Our primary mission, Gideon continued, his voice ringing with conviction, will be to create value, not just for our shareholders, but for our employees, our communities, and our planet. Then came the final devastating blow. Furthermore, Ms. Reyes will be calling an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. Monday to discuss the future composition of the board of directors. His eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, found Lorraine Adler in the crowd. All current members are of course expected to attend to discuss their future, or lack thereof, with the company. Lorraine Adler shuddered. It was not a subtle flinch, but a full-body tremor. The colour drained from her face, and she clutched her expensive evening bag to her chest, like a life raft, her eyes darting frantically around the room. But there was no escape. Every eye was on her, the public face of betrayal and failed conspiracy. Her career was over. Tonight marks a new beginning for Aethelred. Gideon concluded, his voice booming with triumph. A return to the founding principles of our visionary co-founder, David Reyes, carried forward by his chosen heir. Thank you. He stepped back from the podium and with a proud smile offered his arm to Cora. The applause began hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation. They were clapping for the sheer breathtaking audacity of it all. They were clapping for the underdog, for the fall of the arrogant, for the kind of poetic justice that rarely ever happens outside of fiction. It was a story they would tell for years. As Gideon escorted Cora from the stage, the sea of power and wealth parted before them. The looks she received were no longer curious or pitying. They were looks of profound respect, of calculation, and for some of outright fear. She was no longer an outsider. She was the new center of their universe. Their path took them directly past the spot where the Holloways stood, a frozen tableau of devastation. Cormac looked like a fallen titan, aged a decade in 10 minutes. But Brendan, his face a twisted mask of impotent fury, was not finished. As Cora drew level with him, he broke away from his catatonic father and took a step into her path, blocking her way. "You!" he hissed, his voice low and shaking with rage. "This is a trick, a fraud. My father will sue you into oblivion. He'll bury you. You're nothing but a puppet, and you won't get away with this." Cora stopped. She gently removed her hand from Gideon's arm and turned to face Brendan fully. The noise of the gala seemed to fade away, creating a pocket of intense personal silence around them. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression not of anger or fear, but of an unnerving, absolute calm. It was the calm of a hurricane's eye, a place of total stillness, surrounded by utter destruction. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice clear and cold as ice, perfectly mimicking the condescending tone he had used on her. "Let me give you a piece of advice." She let the words hang there, twisting the knife of his own arrogance. His angry bluster faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes as he heard his own prelude to cruelty being used against him. "People like you," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, drawing him in. "Your time is over, you had your turn to see how the world works. But don't get comfortable." She paused for a beat, letting the full weight of her new reality, of his new powerlessness, crash down upon him. She watched the last vestiges of defiance crumble from his face, replaced by a dawning, abject humiliation. Because as of tomorrow, she delivered the final fatal line. "This is my world." Her eyes were relentless. "And you don't belong here." Without another word, without a backward glance, she turned and walked away. She took Gideon's offered arm and moved through the parting crowd, leaving Brendan Holloway standing alone in the wreckage of his own making, publicly vivisected by the very words he had used as a weapon, finally and irrevocably silenced. The walk to the boardroom on the 80th floor of the Aethelred Holdings tower was the longest of Coraline Reyes' life. The thick plush carpet absorbed the sound of her heels, creating an unnerving silence as she, Gideon, and Franklin Shaw moved through the hushed executive wing. Employees, normally bustling with Monday morning energy, stood aside with a new kind of deference. Their glances were a mixture of awe, fear, and intense curiosity. In the span of a single weekend, she had gone from being a ghost in their midst to the new gravity around which their entire professional world now orbited. Cora could feel the ghost of the girl from the gala clinging to her, the girl who felt like an imposter in a $5,000 dress. She had to consciously push that memory down, burying it under the weight of her new reality. When they reached the towering oak doors of the boardroom, Gideon paused and looked at her, his eyes searching. "Remember what your father wrote in the protocol," he said, his voice low and steady. "A ship is not built to stay in the harbor. It's built to navigate the storm. You are the captain now. Steer the ship." Cora gave him a firm nod, took a final fortifying breath, and pushed the doors open. The room was a cathedral of corporate power. A 30-foot-long table of polished mahogany dominated the space, its surface reflecting the grim, tense faces of the 12 board members already seated. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, almost oppressive view of the New York skyline. It was a view meant to remind those within the room of their dominance over the world below. Today, it only seemed to highlight the precariousness of their positions. Cora walked to the head of the table, to the high-backed leather chair that had been Gideon's throne for 3 decades. The air was thick with unspoken resentment and anxiety. She could feel their collective judgment washing over her, her age, her gender, her sudden, inexplicable ascendance. To them, she was a disruption, a black swan event that threatened the comfortable, predictable ecosystem they had inhabited for years. Gideon took the seat to her right, a symbolic gesture of abdication and support. Franklin Shaw sat to her left, his briefcase open, a silent sentinel of legal authority. Cora deliberately took a moment before speaking, letting her gaze travel from face to face. She saw Henderson, a portly man, whose face was already flushed with indignation. She saw others whose expressions were carefully neutral. Professional gamblers waiting to see the next card turned. And she saw Lorraine Adler. The Iron Lady looked brittle, her face a pale powdered mask of composure that couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. She had gambled on the Holloways and lost spectacularly. Finally, Cora placed her hands on the table. "Good morning," she began. Her voice was calm, measured, and carried to every corner of the room without any need for electronic amplification. "Thank you all for being here on such short notice." She paused, letting them absorb the simple, undeniable fact of her presence in that chair. "I am Coraline Reyes, and as of Friday evening, I am the majority shareholder of Aethelred Holdings. I know this has been an abrupt transition, and I want to begin by acknowledging the work that everyone in this room has done for many years under the leadership of Mr. Pierce. This company did not become a global force by accident. This small olive branch caught some of them off guard. It wasn't the fiery entrance of a radical revolutionary. It was the calculated opening of a chess master. But she continued her tone, shifting from gracious to firm. The world is changing, and a failure to evolve is a choice to perish. My new role is not born of personal ambition, but of a profound obligation. An obligation to a legacy that was almost lost, and a vision for a future that we will no longer ignore." She let that statement settle before delivering the first blow. "My father, David Reyes, left behind a comprehensive strategic directive known as the Nightingale Protocol, and it is not a suggestion. It is now the guiding charter of this corporation. A full copy has been distributed to your tablets. The first order of business under this protocol is a complete portfolio realignment." She saw Henderson's knuckles turn white where he gripped his pen. "Effective immediately, we will begin the divestment of all holdings in fossil fuel extraction and exploration, as well as any ventures involved in predatory, high-interest lending. The process is to be completed within 6 months." A sharp intake of breath came from across the table. These sectors were cash cows, reliable, if morally dubious sources of profit. All capital from these divestments, Cora pressed on her voice like steel, will be reallocated. "We are establishing 2 new flagship divisions, a green tech initiative focused on renewable energy and carbon capture technology, and a biomedical research wing dedicated to accessible gene-based therapies. The Nightingale Protocol outlines specific acquisition targets and a 5-year growth plan." "This is insanity," someone muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. Cora's eyes flicked towards the sound, but she didn't stop. "Furthermore, we are making immediate changes to our internal financial structure. All executive bonuses for this fiscal year are cancelled." This time the reaction was a jolt, as if the room had been electrified. These bonuses were not just perks. They were entitlements, foundational to the lifestyle of everyone at the table. That capital, which amounts to over $200 million, will be used to establish a new employee profit-sharing trust fund. Additionally, we are immediately raising the minimum wage for every Aethelred employee and contractor worldwide to a locally adjusted living wage. Our success will no longer be built on the backs of underpaid labor. This was the final straw for Henderson. He slammed his pen down on the table, the sharp crack echoing in the stunned silence. "Ms. Reyes," he boomed, his face a mask of crimson fury. "With all due respect, which is very little at this point, you can't just walk in here, a child, and light a match to a 30-year-old corporate culture. You're talking about dismantling our most profitable divisions based on some sentimental, idealistic nonsense." Your father scribbled down. "The market will panic. Our investors will flee. You'll drive the stock into the ground by Wednesday." He was standing now, leaning over the table, his voice filled with the rage of a man whose world was being torched before his eyes. Cora remained seated, her calm a stark contrast to his apoplexy. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. When he finally ran out of steam, sputtering into silence, she simply said, "Mr. Henderson, the market is already reacting. I suggest you check the current stock price." Her voice was so devoid of emotion, it was chilling. Franklin Shaw, with a quiet keystroke, brought the main boardroom monitor to life. It displayed the live feed from the New York Stock Exchange. Aethelred's ticker symbol, ATH, was displayed in bright green. After a volatile pre-market, the stock had not plummeted. It was surging. It was up nearly 12%, with a trading volume 10 times the daily average. News of the founder's heir, the visionary Nightingale Protocol, and the pivot to the booming ESG sector had created a firestorm of positive interest. The entire board stared at the screen. Henderson's jaw went slack. The numbers didn't lie. His entire argument, his entire worldview had just been rendered obsolete by a single glowing green number. He sank back into his chair, deflated and speechless. Cora's gaze swept the room once more, now holding every ounce of power. "The culture you're so desperate to protect, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "is one of complacency. It is the culture that nearly allowed this company to be consumed by vultures like Holloway Capital simply because they smelled decay. The culture my father envisioned, the one I am here to build, is one of innovation, integrity, and resilience." She leaned forward slightly. "That means we will invest in things that last. We will treat our employees as partners, and we will not apologize for pursuing a profit that doesn't come at the cost of our planet or our principles. That is the future of Aethelred Holdings." She straightened up, her message delivered. "You can either be a part of it, or you can follow Ms. Adler out the door. The choice is yours. You have until the end of the day to decide." Her final gaze fell upon Lorraine Adler. "Ms. Adler, the board accepts your resignation. A full internal audit of your trading activities and communications will commence this afternoon. I trust you will cooperate fully." Without another word, Lorraine gathered her things with trembling hands and walked out of the boardroom, not as an iron lady, but as a ghost. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, sealing her fate. Later that afternoon, the battle won, Cora stood alone in her new office. It was vast and still held the faint, lingering scent of Gideon's cigars. She hadn't moved anything in yet, except for a single small framed photograph, which she placed in the center of the massive empty desk. It was the picture of her and her father at Coney Island, their faces bright with laughter. The silence of the room was a stark contrast to the storm she had just unleashed. She felt the immense weight of her decisions, the thousands of lives and billions of dollars that now pivoted on her command. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. A news alert chimed on her phone. She glanced at it. The headline from the Wall Street Journal read, "Holloway Capital stock plummets 30%. Following failed Aethelred takeover. SEC confirms formal investigation into Cormac Holloway for market manipulation." A smaller secondary story noted that Brendan Holloway had been indefinitely suspended and escorted from his office building that morning. She felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't the sweet satisfaction of revenge she might have once craved. It was a distant, somber sense of closure. The Holloways were not the enemy. They were just a symptom of the disease. Her real work, the work of building the cure, had just begun. She looked from the news alert to the photograph of her father. She remembered his tired eyes in those last few months, the weight he carried alone. He had borne it all so that she could be standing here in this room at this moment. He had built the ship and entrusted her to steer it through the storm. She touched the cool platinum of the Nightingale pin on her dress, then looked back at her father's smiling, carefree face. "I belong here, Dad," she whispered, her voice soft but certain in the quiet of the great office. "We belong here." The sun was beginning its slow descent over the Hudson, casting long golden shadows across the city. For the old guard, it was the setting sun of their era. But for Coraline Reyes and the legacy of her father, it was without a doubt the dawn. And so Coraline Reyes' journey began. It wasn't just a story of revenge against a millionaire bully. It was the story of a legacy fulfilled and a new future forged from the ashes of old greed. She proved that your value isn't determined by the label society puts on you, but by the strength of your character and the vision you fight for. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the person who seems most out of place is the one who is meant to change everything. What did you think of Cora's incredible transformation? Have you ever witnessed a moment of such perfect poetic justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by Cora's story and believe in the power of legacy, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories of triumph against the odds.